Last week, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese attended the Pacific Islands Forum, and you'd think by the reaction of the media that his attendance marked the start of a golden era in the relationship between Australia and its Pacific neighbours.
Albanese here in Suva today, he will be welcomed and his new climate targets will be welcomed as well.
Anthony Albanese at his first Pacific Islands Forum and looking comfortable among new friends.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has embraced the political challenges in the Pacific, moving quickly to mend broken relationships in the region during his trip to Fiji.
Australia went to this forum represented by a new government with a more ambitious climate policy. What difference has that made when it comes to Australia's position and standing in the region?
I think it's made an enormous difference.
This more ambitious position helped the Australian PM this week, didn't it?
It did, and I think, I'm not surprising that he wasn't being pressed too hard on this, because this was in effect a bit of a reset in terms of Australia's management of its relationship with the Pacific Island nations.
Now, compare this to the hammering the media gave Prime Minister Scott Morrison in 2019 when he attended the forum.
Mr Morrison also promised $500 million of aid money would go towards helping Pacific Islanders deal with climate change. But while that was welcome, Tuvalu's Prime Minister said he was disappointed.
No matter how much money you put on the table, it doesn't give you the excuse not to do the right thing, that is cutting down your emission, including not opening your coal mines.
In fact, a lot of Pacific leaders criticised Australia and said we should be doing more.
Is there a good story to tell in Tuvalu this week or not really?
I think there's a good story about a bunch of countries standing up to one of the big polluters, particularly Australia. I mean, Scott Morrison, he's, about as welcome as diarrhea in a wetsuit at that place.
Pacific Island leaders had other leaders there saying we can do net zero, and Scott Morrison was standing out.
Morrison also faced intense criticism both from the forum and from Australian journalists because he would not bow to the demands to close coal mines. But not too many in the media outlets were telling you that a certain opposition leader was of the same mind.
And while the Labor leader lashed the government for its lack of a climate plan, he didn't call for an end to coal mining.
Our export of coal will remain an important part of Australia's economy.
And this week, again, the government confirmed that policy has not changed.
Mining's been a really important part of Australia's prosperity for decades, for generations in fact. And mining will continue to be an important part of Australia's prosperity.
Same policy but different party. Doesn't it change the tone of the media coverage? Kel, keen to get your thoughts. Labor, coalition, there are some slight changes, but obviously both have that 2050 net zero target. Labor has an accelerated approach to it, very negligible in the big scheme of things in terms of global emissions. You would think that Labor is walking into here with this drastically different climate change policy, but it's pretty much the same policy and they're getting praised for it.
Yes, which is almost unbelievable. And Labor is not going to shut down any coal mines because why? Because of the unions. They're not allowed to. It's not going to happen. And of course it would destroy Australia's economy. So that was never on the table. To pretend it was on the table for Scott Morrison was deceptive. It was a really nasty illusion, I think. But you could hear some of the words they were using. One journalist talked about, here they were confronting a major emitter. Australia produces 1.2% of the world's greenhouse gases. There's no major emitter at the table when they have this conference. I mean, it's worse than being biased. It is actually being factually wrong. I'm going to give you wrong information and I'm going to try to sell it to you as a journalist. And when you hear the word reset, which is what we heard from one of the journalists, the big story is not what Albanese does or what Morrison did. It's we've got to reset. We got rid of that government because we're left-wingers and we've got our government in.
That's such a good point. Do you remember when the media was saying that, the Pacific Islands are turning to China because Australia is such a bad emitter? That was a legitimate argument that was going on there. But Lisa, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this as well. What do you make of the way that the media has covered Labor? Do you think it's unfair considering the coalition's policy is so closely aligned to Labor's?
Look, I think it's interesting that they have not at all honed in on the fact that you talk about you can't just throw money at the problem and it will go away. Well, exactly look at what China is doing. It is all about money. And if you want to play this on the climate war front, well, Australia under Morrison or under Albanese were both making more of a contribution towards addressing climate change than what China has ever done. You know, what China is allowed to do, they're emitting a full year's worth of emissions in 16 days. So if they're serious about having this argument on climate change and pushing us up against China, it doesn't hold any water. And the journalists aren't pointing that out. They're more than happy to back Labor in. And as you say, every chance they had, they attacked Morrison over this. But they certainly weren't bringing in that factor of China and those emissions.
Yeah, Lisa's right. There's almost a degree of self-loathing, nature to some of these questions. Why aren't the journalists putting the pressure back on India and China, Kel?
Oh, because they're not interested in climate. They're interested in playing a domestic political game. It's got nothing to do with the climate. I mean, it's like the South Pacific leaders. They are politicians. If they're leaders of their country, they are politicians. They're playing a political game. If we play the climate card, we get money, right? That's all they care about. And as Lisa quite rightly said, they're getting more money from China. China comes along and says, because he wants to buy friends, we will build this, we will do that for you, sign up to the Belt and Roads Initiative or whatever. It's all about money in the end. And so consequently, no one is interested. No one ever talks about China or India. That doesn't matter where the climate activists are. Piers Morgan this week talked to a couple of really loony climate activists on his program. No interest in what China and India are doing, who are doing all the emitting. All they want to do is to shut down Great Britain. I mean, so no one is interested in the truth. No one is interested in looking at the real world. They're all interested in living in their little Alice in Wonderland fantasy where we can fight a battle with our governments and make our governments do something. I just worry. Well, there's no scepticism left in journalism.
There's also that argument that, we should do it and be the example, set the example for China, as if China's going to pay attention to this egalitarian approach to policy.